By late 1943, the Japanese High Command knew that the tide of the war had turned. They had lost at Midway. They had lost Guadalcanal. The perimeter was shrinking. But they had a plan. A line in the ocean that must not be crossed. They called it the Zetaiko Kubo Ken, the absolute national defense sphere. This was a strategic boundary that ran from the Kuril Islands in the north, through the Bonin Islands, down to the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, and west to the Philippines. To the Japanese war planners, this line was sacred. They believed that as long as they held this in a ring, the American Navy could not attack the Japanese home islands. Saipan was the keystone of this arch. It was a mountainous island, heavily fortified, and garrisoned by 30,000 troops. The Japanese propaganda machine told the public that Saipan was impregnable. They compared it to a fortress that could never fall. In Tokyo, the generals and admirals assured the emperor that any American attempt to breach this line would be met with the full force of the combined fleet. They planned a decisive battle, Kantai Kessen. They believed they would lure the American fleet into the trap of the Marianas and destroy it. The War Cabinet viewed Saipan not just as an island, but as a shield. They calculated that the Americans would need months, perhaps years, to fight their way through the outer islands of Micronesia before they could even think about attacking the Marianas. They believed they had time. Time to rebuild their carrier air groups. Time to train new pilots. Time to build new planes. But the Americans were moving faster than the Japanese timetables allowed. That island-hopping strategy of Admiral Nimitz was bypassing the strong points and leaping forward with terrifying speed. The Japanese leaders looked at their maps in Tokyo, confident in their red line. They didn't realize that the Americans had a different map, one that showed the range of a new bomber that turned Saipan from a defensive shield into a mortal threat. The absolute defense sphere was about to be tested, and it was made of glass. The man responsible for holding that line was General Hideki Tojo. By 1944, Tojo was more than just a prime minister. He was a dictator in all but name. He had consolidated power to a degree unprecedented in modern Japanese history. He held the position of prime minister. He was also the war minister. And recently, he had taken the role of chief of the Imperial Army General Staff. He controlled the government, the army administration, and the operational command. He was the razor. Sharp, efficient, and bureaucratic. Tojo had staked his entire reputation on the prosecution of the war. He told the emperor that the situation was under control. He silenced his critics. He censored the press. He assured the Japanese people that the losses in the Solomons were minor setbacks. But internally, Tojo was worried. He knew the industrial disparity between Japan and the United States was growing. He knew that the merchant fleet was being strangled by American submarines. But he believed in the spiritual superiority of the Japanese soldier. He believed that the Yamato spirit could overcome material disadvantages. Saipan was crucial to Tojo's political survival. He had personally inspected the defenses of the Marianas, on paper and via envoys. He had promised the emperor that the islands would hold. The Americans will bleed themselves dry on the beaches, he reportedly said. He needed a victory. The Japanese public was getting restless. The food rations were shrinking. The air raid drills were becoming more frequent. Tojo needed to show that the Empire could stop the American juggernaut. He tied his fate to the island of Saipan. If Saipan stood, Tojo stood. If Saipan fell, the justification for his total control would evaporate. He was a man walking a tightrope over a volcano, and he was about to lose his balance. June 15, 1944. D-Day for Saipan. When the reports reached Tokyo, the War Cabinet was stunned by the scale of the American operation. They had expected an attack, yes. But they expected a raid, or a small landing. What appeared off the coast of Saipan was the largest armada the Pacific had ever seen. 535 ships. 127,000 troops, Marines and Army. 15 aircraft carriers. 7 fast battleships. The Japanese observers on the island radioed back in panic, "The sea is black with ships." The bombardment was cataclysmic. For days, the American battleships hammered the island. The Japanese defenders, dug into caves and bunkers, survived, but their communications were shattered. In Tokyo, the mood shifted from confidence to alarm. They realized that the Americans weren't just probing the absolute defense sphere, they were kicking down the door. But Tojo and the Navy High Command still had hope. They had a plan. Operation Ago. They had gathered 9 aircraft carriers and hundreds of land-based planes. They believed this was the opportunity they had been waiting for. The Americans were tied down protecting their landing beaches. They were vulnerable. The Japanese Navy would sail out, launch a massive air attack, destroy the American carriers, and strand the invasion force on the beaches of Saipan. It was the classic Japanese doctrine, one decisive blow to win the war. The generals in Tokyo rubbed their hands. The Americans have walked into our trap, they thought. They sent a message to the fleet, the fate of the Empire rests on this one battle. They didn't know that the American fleet was twice the size of theirs. And they didn't know that the American pilots were waiting for them, not with fear, but with anticipation. June 19, 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese Navy launched its counterstroke. Admiral Ozawa sent 373 planes to attack the American fleet covering Saipan. In Tokyo, the War Cabinet waited for the news of a great victory. They waited for reports of burning American carriers. Instead, they received silence. Then, fragments of disaster. The American radar had picked up the Japanese planes 150 miles away. The American interceptors, the F-6F Hellcats, rose to meet them. The Japanese pilots were inexperienced. Their training had been rushed. The American pilots were veterans, flying superior machines. It wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In a few hours, the Japanese lost nearly 300 planes. The Americans lost 29. It was the death of the Japanese naval air arm. But it got worse. American submarines sank 2 Japanese carriers, Taiho and Shokaku. American bombers sank a third, Hyo, the next day. The Japanese fleet fled. When the news reached Tokyo, the leadership was paralyzed. They had played their ace card. Operation Ago was supposed to save Saipan. Instead, the Navy had been shattered. The carriers returned to Japan empty, without planes or pilots. This meant that the garrison on Saipan was alone. There would be no rescue. There would be no reinforcement. No supplies. General Saito, commanding the defense of Saipan, was told the grim news: the Navy cannot help you. You must hold out alone. For Tojo, this was the beginning of the end. He realized that the strategy of the decisive battle had failed. The Americans controlled the sea and the sky. The absolute defense sphere had been breached, and there was nothing left to plug the hole. The cabinet meeting in Tokyo that followed the naval defeat was a somber affair. The bluster was gone. They looked at the map, at the lonely island of Saipan, and realized they were looking at a graveyard. While Tojo projected strength to the public, the foundation of his power was crumbling behind the moat of the imperial palace. Emperor Hirohito was a man of few words, but his silence spoke volumes. For years, he had been told by the military that the war was winnable. He had been shown maps with expanding Japanese territory. Now, the maps were shrinking. The defeat at the Philippine Sea shook the emperor. He realized the navy was broken. His closest advisor was Koichi Kido, the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal. Kido was the gatekeeper to the throne and a political realist. Kido began to whisper in the emperor's ear. "Your Majesty," Kido suggested, "the military is misleading you. Tojo has promised victories he cannot deliver." The emperor began to ask uncomfortable questions during briefings. When the chiefs of staff presented plans for the defense of Saipan, the emperor asked, "Is this another Guadalcanal? Are we just sending men to die without hope?" The generals stammered. They had no answers. The emperor's anxiety wasn't just about military defeat. It was about the survival of the imperial institution itself, the Kokutai. If the war continued until total destruction, the monarchy would be destroyed with it. Hirohito knew that Tojo had accumulated too much power. He was starting to look less like a servant of the emperor and more like a shogun. The political winds in Tokyo were shifting. The peace faction, a quiet group of former diplomats and politicians who knew the war was doomed, began to find a sympathetic ear in the palace. They couldn't move against Tojo yet. The army was too powerful. A coup might trigger a civil war. But the emperor's lack of confidence was a signal. It was the crack in the dam. Tojo knew that he served at the pleasure of the emperor. If he lost Hirohito's trust, his dictatorship was over. Saipan was his last chance to prove to the throne that his strategy could work. Why was Saipan so vital? Why did its loss trigger a political crisis that the loss of Guadalcanal or Tarawa did not? The answer lay in the physics of a new American weapon. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress. It was the most advanced bomber of the war. It flew higher, faster, and carried more bombs than anything else. But its most terrifying attribute was its range, 3,250 miles. Throughout the war, the Japanese home islands had been relatively safe. The Doolittle raid in 1942 was a stunt. The American bombers based in China were too far away to carry heavy loads effectively. The Japanese leaders had drawn circles on their maps. When they drew a circle with a 1,500-mile radius around Tokyo, the edge of that circle touched Saipan. When the Americans landed on Saipan, they weren't just taking an island. They were seizing an unsinkable aircraft carrier within striking distance of the homeland. In the War Ministry in Tokyo, officers stared at these maps in horror. They realized that once the Americans built airfields on Saipan, the B-29s could begin a systematic campaign of strategic bombing. Japan's cities were built largely of wood and paper. They were incredibly vulnerable to incendiary attacks. The factories that built the Zeros and the munitions were concentrated in Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka. All were now in range. One Japanese admiral later called Saipan a pistol pointed at the heart of Japan. The War Cabinet realized that the war had fundamentally changed. It was no longer a fight for distant resources in Southeast Asia. It was now a fight for the physical survival of the Japanese nation. The loss of Saipan meant that the civilians, the mothers and children of the soldiers fighting at the front, were now on the front line themselves. This reality shattered the illusion of security that Tojo had maintained. The war was coming home. By early July, the situation on Saipan was apocalyptic. The 30,000 defenders had been pushed into the northern tip of the island. They were starving. They had no fresh water. Their artillery was destroyed. They were fighting tanks with magnetic mines strapped to bamboo poles. General Yoshitsuga Saito, the island commander, knew it was the end. He was an old, sick man, wounded in the fighting. He sat in a cave, illuminated by a flickering candle, the sounds of American mortars getting closer. He composed his final message to the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. It was not a message of defiance, but of profound sorrow and apology. I offer my deepest apologies to the Emperor and the people of Japan for not being able to defend this critical island, he wrote. He described the condition of his troops. We have fought for more than 20 days without supplies. The soldiers are drinking sea water and eating snails. He ended with a grim epitaph for his army: we have built a dike with our bodies to hold back the American tide. But the dike has broken. After sending the message, General Saito, following the samurai tradition, committed ritual suicide, seppuku, in his cave. When this telegram reached Tokyo, it was read in stunned silence by the War Cabinet. Tojo heard the words and knew his dike had broken too. There was no spin he could put on this. The bravest soldiers of the Empire, fighting with suicidal courage, had been completely defeated by American material superiority. The telegram was a death sentence for the Tojo government. It proved that the spiritual power he championed was no match for flamethrowers and overwhelming artillery. The generals and admirals in Tokyo looked around the table, none daring to meet the other's eyes, knowing they were responsible for the sacrifice of 30,000 men for nothing. The military defeat was complete. But the deepest tragedy of Saipan was human. Unlike other islands the Americans had taken, Saipan had a large civilian population, about 25,000 Japanese colonists. For years, they had been subjected to intense government propaganda. They were told that the Americans were monsters, that they would rape the women, torture the men, and eat the children. As the American net closed, thousands of civilians were trapped on the northern cliffs at Marpi Point, overlooking the sea. The Japanese military authorities had issued a chilling directive. Civilians were not to surrender. To be captured was a fate worse than death. It brought shame upon the family and the nation. Emperor Hirohito himself, allegedly at Tojo's urging, issued an imperial rescript encouraging civilians to choose death over capture, promising them a place in the afterlife similar to fallen soldiers. What followed was one of the most horrifying scenes of the war. American interpreters with loudspeakers pleaded with the civilians to surrender, promising food and water. But fear was stronger. Driven by terror and urged on by surviving Japanese soldiers, who sometimes shot those who hesitated, entire families began to jump. Mothers threw their babies off the 200-foot cliffs before jumping themselves. Fathers tied their families together with ropes and walked into the ocean to drown. American Marines watched in horror, helpless to stop it. Thousands died in this mass suicide. When news of this reached Tokyo, the reaction was mixed. Publicly, the government praised the purity and self-sacrifice of the civilians. They used it as propaganda to steel the nation for the coming battles on the homeland. But privately, in the quiet rooms of the palace and the ministries, many were sickened. They realized that their ideology had created a death cult. They had convinced their own people to kill their children rather than face an enemy that was bringing them food. It was a moral stain that even the hardest generals found difficult to wash away. It was the ultimate proof of the bankruptcy of Tojo's leadership. By July 7, 1944, the remaining Japanese garrison on Saipan, about 4,000 men, was trapped in the north. They were wounded, starving, and almost out of ammunition. General Saito was dead. Command fell to the surviving officers who decided to execute the final stage of Japanese defensive doctrine, Gyokusai. It translates literally to jewel shattering. It comes from an ancient Chinese poem, better to be a jewel smashed to pieces than a whole tile. It meant honorable annihilation rather than surrender. At dawn, the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War began. It was a scene of pathetic bravery and utter horror. Thousands of men surged toward the American lines held by the 105th Infantry Regiment. At the front were able-bodied soldiers with rifles and bayonets. Behind them came the walking wounded, covered in bandages, hobbling on crutches. Behind them came men armed only with rocks, sticks, or knives tied to bamboo poles. They weren't attacking with any military objective. They were attacking to die. They overran the American front lines through sheer weight of numbers. American machine gunners fired until their barrels melted, and still the Japanese came. The battle devolved into brutal hand-to-hand combat. It lasted for 15 hours. When it was over, nearly 4,300 Japanese soldiers lay dead in a small area. The American lines held, but at a terrible cost. When the reports of the Gyokusai reached Tokyo, the propaganda machine glorified it as the ultimate expression of the Japanese spirit. But in the war cabinet, the mood was grim. They realized that Gyokusai was not a strategy, it was national suicide. If every island was defended this way, Japan would run out of men long before America ran out of bullets. Saipan proved that the Japanese soldier would fight to the death, but it also proved that his death would not stop the American advance. While the soldiers were dying on Saipan, the political knives were coming out in Tokyo. For years, the political elite of Japan had chafed under Tojo's dictatorship. These were the Jushin, the senior statesmen. They were former prime ministers, retired admirals, and aristocrats. They were conservative, intensely loyal to the emperor, and they hated Tojo. They saw him as an upstart, a bureaucrat who had usurped the traditional power structure and was leading the nation to ruin. Men like Admiral Keisuke Okada and Prince Kono had been meeting secretly, whispering in tea houses, waiting for the right moment to strike. The fall of Saipan was that moment. Tojo could no longer claim he was winning. The B-29s were coming. The navy was sunk. The Jushin made their move. They didn't have tanks, they had access. They lobbied the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, Kido, the man closest to the emperor. They warned Kido that if Tojo remained in power, the country would be destroyed, and the imperial house with it. They argued that Tojo had concentrated too much power in his own hands. As Prime Minister, War Minister, and Chief of Staff, there was no one else to blame. The pressure on the palace was immense. Tojo sensed the conspiracy. He tried to use the military police, Kempeitai, to intimidate the Jushin, but they were too prominent to simply arrest. It was a slow-motion political assassination. The old guard of Japan was reclaiming control from the military junta, using the disaster of Saipan as their weapon. Cornered, General Tojo tried one last desperate maneuver to save his government. He decided to reshuffle his cabinet. He wanted to bring in fresh faces, perhaps even some critics, to create a national unity government and spread the blame for the defeat. To do this, tradition dictated that his entire current cabinet had to resign first, allowing him to reappoint them or choose successors. It was usually a formality. Tojo called a cabinet meeting. He demanded their resignations. Most of the ministers, terrified of the razor, quietly agreed. But one man did not. Nobusuke Kishi was the Minister of Munitions. He was the man responsible for Japanese industry. He knew better than anyone that the war was hopelessly lost. The factories had no steel. The planes had no aluminum. The ships had no oil. Kishi sat at the table, arms crossed, looking at the dictator. "I refuse to resign," Kishi said calmly. Tojo was stunned. No one defied him to his face. Tojo screamed at him, threatening him. Kishi didn't budge. He knew the Constitution. If one minister refused to resign, the Prime Minister could not unilaterally fire him without dissolving the entire government. Kishi was daring Tojo to fire him, knowing it would bring the whole house of cards down. He told Tojo that reshuffling the cabinet was useless. The problem wasn't the ministers, the problem was the war itself. In that tense meeting room, Tojo's aura of invincibility evaporated. The dictator who commanded millions of soldiers couldn't even command his own Minister of Munitions. Kishi's defiance was the final nail in the coffin. Tojo realized he had lost control of his own government. On July 18, 1944, 9 days after Saipan was officially declared secured by the Americans, Hideki Tojo went to the imperial palace. He met with Emperor Hirohito. Usually, the emperor would offer words of encouragement or support. This time, Hirohito was cool and distant. He accepted Tojo's report on the loss of Saipan without comment. Tojo realized the emperor's support, the bedrock of his power, was gone. He returned to his residence and drafted his resignation. He resigned as Prime Minister, War Minister, and Chief of General Staff. The man who had led Japan into Pearl Harbor, who had promised a new order in Asia, was out. A new government was formed, led by General Koiso and Admiral Yonai. The Japanese public was told that Tojo had resigned to renew the national spirit. There was a brief sigh of relief among the elites, a hope that perhaps the new government could negotiate a peace. But reality set in quickly. The new government changed nothing. They couldn't bring back the sunken ships. They couldn't stop the American advance. And in November 1944, the first B-29 bombers flying from the newly built airfields on Saipan appeared over Tokyo. The firebombing began. The fall of Saipan was the turning point not just on the battlefield, but in the minds of the Japanese leadership. Before Saipan, they believed they could win. After Saipan, they knew they would lose. What the War Cabinet said when Saipan fell was not a public declaration. It was a private admission, in whispers among statesmen, in a defiant refusal by a minister, and in the silence of an emperor, that the empire was doomed. The war would drag on for another terrifying year of fire and atomic destruction, but the decision had effectively been made on the cliffs of Saipan.